the second temple. You can see the sanctuary here, the steps that lead up to it. You can see the altar right there. Here. Sorry. So the altar is right there. Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be with you. Get my stuff together here. All right, who's with us learning on a Friday afternoon as we're getting ready for Shabbos? It's Shabbos Tisha B'Av, so we're putting off our commemoration of Tisha B'Av until Sunday. Reminder, because it's Tisha B'Av being observed Saturday night and Sunday, we have no class tomorrow night and no class on Sunday. We're doing a double daf today, 2 pages today, and we'll do 2 pages on Monday, and then we'll be caught up. But no class Saturday night, no class on Sunday. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Friday afternoon? James in Indianapolis, Guy in Dayton, Yehuda in South Carolina, Anna L's got 2 thumbs up, Paul in the Great Northwest, Miriam in Colorado, John in Maine, where am I? Tom in PA, Sharon in New Jersey, wishing everyone an easy fast. Belle in North Texas, Adrian says hello, Lesuk and Eugenia, where did you get that model of the temple? Nina bought it for me as a gift for my birthday last year. I don't know where she got it, but I think you can Google, model of the second temple. It's all made out of wood, a kind of lightweight wood, and I glued it together. It was really fun. A little bit challenging, but fun to build, and I love having it around. It's funny. I wish we'd had it when we were doing Tractate Yoma. When we were talking so much about what went on in the temple. It would have been really useful. But there will be stuff coming up when it will certainly serve us in our journey through Daf Yomi. Over there on the YouTube side, welcome Yitzhak from Kansas City. All right, we've got 2 pages to cover. Let us not waste any time at all. Okay, our pages today are, we're in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud, pages 30 and 31. We're in chapter 3. Generally speaking, these are the laws of marriage contracts. Here in chapter 3, we've opened with the related topic of the punishment of a rapist or a seducer that the Torah mandates. Generally speaking, if he rapes a young woman, that he's going to have to pay a fine for raping her, and he's obligated to marry her, and he will never have the right to divorce her. This is if she wants to marry her rapist. And so he's basically going to have to support her for the rest of his life because of his crime. She doesn't have to marry him if she doesn't want to. And then the question that comes up in our first Mishna is, well, what if it's prohibited for him to marry her? Because, for example, she's a mamzeret, and so he's prohibited to marry her. She's prohibited to marry him. So therefore, if the penalty is marrying her and paying a fine, and now marrying her is off the table, does the fine remain in place? Yes, it does. That's what Mishnah number 1 teaches. we're separating the kind of tragic emotional content from this discussion, and the fact that there's other punishments. I mean, when somebody rapes a woman under Jewish law, he's also liable for pain and suffering. He's liable for any actual physical injury, and he's probably liable to the death penalty, at least in certain cases, but we're separating that out and talking about the fine. Now, actually, in today's daf, we're going to be talking, well, wait a minute. What if he's liable for a death penalty offense? For example, seduction is not a death penalty offense. But what if the woman that he sleeps with is related to him? For example, it's his sister, or it's his brother's wife or his father's wife or something like that. Which carries with it a death penalty, but death at the hands of heaven, and sometimes even death at the hands of an earthly court. So if there's a death penalty involved, or lashes, right, whipping, then is he also liable for the monetary fine? And there, not always. So whereas in sort of modern American law, a prosecutor will pile on the charges, and there can, for the same crime, you might be guilty of a bunch of different offenses, which, will lead to multiplying the time that a person spends in prison, and monetary fines as well. Under Jewish law, if you're guilty for the death penalty, you're not also guilty for the fine. You're just subject to the more stringent penalty. So let's talk about that. We picked this up on page 30a, a few paragraphs down. Rav Chisda said, everyone agrees with regard to one who engaged in forced intercourse, so rape, with a menstruating woman, that he pays the fine. What's going on here? Why does it matter that she's menstruating? Because even if they're married, it is prohibited for a couple to have sex when she is menstruating. And if they do it intentionally, the penalty for that might be death at the hands of the heavenly court. So does he also pay the fine? It says here, yes. And he elaborates, according to the one who says that the criterion is whether there is betrothal. Well, for this woman too, there is betrothal. You can be betrothed to a woman who happens to be menstruating. And according to the one who says that the criterion is whether the woman is suitable for him to sustain. This woman is suitable for him to sustain. This is an outgrowth of yesterday's discussion where they were examining, what if you tried to betroth a woman who is prohibited to you? Does the betrothal take effect? You might not be permitted to marry her, but the betrothal takes effect to the extent that you're going to need a bill of divorce in order to break off this betrothal you never should have gotten into in the first place. That's according to one opinion. According to a different opinion, if it's prohibited for her to marry you, then when you tried to betroth her, you did nothing at all, and so it doesn't take effect. And in either of these cases, or in the case where the woman is prohibited to you, and where we're arguing whether betrothal takes effect or not, then we might ask, well, if you raped such a woman, is there just death penalty? Is there a fine, etc.? That was yesterday's discussion. Now we continue today. So the Gemara comments, and the Mishna's ruling that one who has relations with his sister, right? So that's somebody that's incest, definitely a death penalty offense. And the Mishnah rules that one who has relations with his sister is liable to pay the fine. And this comes to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana would render Yom Kippur like Shabbos with regard to payment for damages. Just as one who intentionally desecrates Shabbos is liable to receive the death penalty and is therefore exempt from the obligation of payment for damages caused while desecrating Shabbos, so too one who intentionally desecrates Yom Kippur is liable to receive the death penalty and is therefore exempt from the obligation of payment for damages caused while desecrating Yom Kippur. Why are they bringing up this example of one who desecrates Shabbos intentionally doesn't have to pay a fine for anything that he damaged while he was desecrating Shabbos? Because if he's liable to the death penalty, he doesn't have to pay the fine. Well, one who sleeps with his sister, he's liable to kares, right? Death at the hands of the heavenly court. So why does he also pay the fine? Well, you might say, well, there's a difference between one who intentionally desecrates Shabbos. That's actually a death penalty offense in an earthly court. I mean, it's never enforced, But when the temple is standing, if there's a Sanhedrin and a person is about to violate Shabbos and two witnesses say to him, if you violate Shabbos, you're going to do that, what you're about to do. If you do it, it's a death penalty offense. And then right away after receiving the warning, he does it. So then he might actually be executed for that. It happened in the wilderness during the after the Exodus from Egypt. So if so, you wouldn't also pay a fine for damaging some property while you were desecrating Shabbos. So shouldn't it be that this guy who sleeps with his sister or rapes his sister doesn't have to pay the fine for raping her if he's subject to the death penalty? But maybe he didn't receive the warning. He's not actually going to receive the death penalty, but she is obviously hurt by this. So it makes sense, perhaps, that he has to pay the fine. Now, the Gemara asks, what is the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana? Abaye said it states the word harm at the hands of man in the verse, but if any harm follow, then you shall give a soul for a soul. That's Exodus 21:23. And it states the word harm at the hand of heaven in the verse which Jacob states, my son shall not descend with you, and harm befalls him on the way. When Jacob didn't want the brothers to bring Benjamin down to Egypt during the famine, where Joseph had gone ahead and become the viceroy of Egypt, etc. But here, harm at the hands of man and harm at the hands of heaven is sort of connected. So says the Gemara, just as with regard to harm that is stated at the hands of man, for example, one who kills and is liable to be executed, one is exempt from the associated payment. So too, with regard to harm that is stated at the hand of heaven, one is exempt from the associated payment. And that would imply that this one who commits incest with his sister, it's a death penalty at the hands of heaven. It's not an earthly court that would impose that death penalty. But just as harm can be caused either by heaven or by our fellow man, and they're connected in the Torah, so too you might think that one who commits a death penalty offense at the hands of heaven shouldn't have to pay the associated fine. So Rav Ada bar Ahava strongly objects to this. From where is it derived that when Jacob is warning his sons about taking Benjamin to Egypt, from where is it derived that when he's making this warning that he is warning them about cold and heat, tzinim pachim? So this cold and heat is a kind of interpretive translation. Others translate those words as thorns and traps. But at any rate, it says, when he is warning them about cold and heat, which are at the hand of heaven. Perhaps he is actually warning them about a lion and thieves, which are harm at the hands of man, meaning that unlike heat and cold, these dangers are not calibrated by God. And the Gemara refutes this. Is that to say that Jacob warned his sons about harm that could befall Benjamin at the hand of man, but about that harm which could befall him at the hand of heaven, he did not warn them? He did not warn them? Come on, Jacob warned them about all potentially harmful matters that might befall Benjamin, not merely one particular form of catastrophe. I remember he had lost Joseph many years before, and now his sort of favorite son is Benjamin because it's the only other son from his favored wife, Rachel. Joseph is gone, and now this ruler, the grand vizier in Egypt, has said, you guys can't have food unless you bring your other brother, Benjamin. Jacob is distressed. He doesn't know that it's Joseph who has sent for Benjamin. And he says, I'm grief-stricken already. It's a long trip you're making to Egypt, and something could happen to Benjamin. That they say, look, we have no choice. We're all going to starve to death unless we bring Benjamin. Of course, Jacob has to let them go. But the point is this warning about harm in these two places in the Torah makes a link between harm at the hands of man and harm at the hands of heaven. Now, you might say, well, everything is in the hands of God, right? So even when people harm us, God sort of allows it to happen. So everything is in the hands of heaven, and that is true. But we also have free will in this world. And, the evil that really transpires in this world, we're not going to excuse the evildoers of the world by saying that everything is in the hands of heaven. People commit evil, and they must be held to account for the evil that they commit. But at any rate, we're having a little bit of a philosophical digression here. So the Gemara asks, and are cold and heat at the hand of heaven? Isn't it taught in a Baraisa, all matters are at the hand of heaven, except for cold and heat? As it is stated, Proverbs 22:5, cold and heat are on the path of the crooked, and he who guards his soul shall keep far from them. And this indicates that cold and heat are forms of harm caused by man from which one can protect himself. And the bottom line, what they're actually saying here is, take a coat. If you're going to go out in the cold, take a warm coat with you. If you're going to go out in the hot heat, take a canteen of water with you. Don't be negligent. Protect yourself. Not everything is predictable in this world, God knows. But don't be negligent when it is in your power to guard yourself and your well-being. It's a very important principle, right? Everything is in the hands of heaven, but heaven empowers us to protect ourselves to some extent. Obviously, not everything is foreseeable, but the kinds of harm that are foreseeable, it's on us to protect ourselves from them. So you wear your seatbelt, You bring a warm coat. If you're climbing a mountain, you bring some food and some water, and you anticipate that it'll get very cold at the top of the mountain, and you bring the appropriate clothing. Take care of yourself when it's possible for you to take care of yourself. And furthermore, are a lion and thieves forms of harm at the hands of man? But didn't Rav Yosef say, and similarly didn't Rabbi Chia teach, a Baraisa in which he said, from the day that the temple was destroyed, although the Sanhedrin was abolished, the 4 death penalties were not abolished. And the Gemara asks, were they not abolished? It is clear that they were abolished, as today there is neither Sanhedrin nor capital punishment. Rather, it means that although there are no court-imposed executions, now we're on 30b, the punishment of the 4 death penalties was not abolished. In fact, the Sanhedrin stopped meeting for death penalty cases even before the Second Temple was destroyed. But certainly after the Second Temple was destroyed, we did not have any longer a rabbinic court that would impose death penalty, would try death penalty cases and impose the death penalty. Right? We didn't have sovereignty over our land. It was now first controlled by the Greeks, and then it was controlled by the Romans, and they were administering, the law. And murderers were put to death, and rapists were put to death by a civil court, as it were. And the rabbinic court was no longer issuing that once the temple was destroyed. But what's interesting in this discussion is you shouldn't think that if you committed a death penalty offense and you weren't caught by the civil authority, that you got away with it, because you didn't. What do they mean by that? One who was liable to be executed by stoning either falls from the roof or a beast tramples him. And that is similar to stoning, which involves being pushed off of an elevated place and then stoned. And one who was liable to be executed by burning either falls into a conflagration or a snake bites him, which creates a burning sensation. And one who is liable to be executed by decapitation is either handed over to the ruling monarchy for execution by sword, or bandits attack and kill him. And one who was liable to be executed by strangulation either drowns in a river or dies of diphtheria. Rather, reverse the order of the previous statement. A lion and thieves are causes of harm at the hands of heaven, while cold and heat are cases of harm at the hands of man. Right, this is a very lovely world picture. We have this understanding that in terms of the spiritual level of the Jewish people, it was highest when we stood at Mount Sinai, right? And then we had the 40 years of being constantly basking in the presence of the Lord, whose presence was in our midst, represented by a tower, a cloud of, a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Constant miracles going on in the tabernacle in the desert, and eventually when the first temple was built, right? The first temple was a place where the presence of the Lord was miraculously manifest at all times. If you entered that, you would see sort of 10 constant miracles going on, including like a shimmering energy, which was the Shekhinah, the presence of the Lord, that God, willed that it should be there over the altar where the sacrifices were brought. Eventually, because of our sins as a people, our sort of negligence with respect to our relationship with God, the level of the people dropped, and dropped so far that we didn't merit to have the temple in our midst, and the first temple was destroyed. The people, did some penance and some atonement during that 70-year exile, and then we merited to have the second temple. Its spiritual level was lower than the first temple. There were some of those constant miracles were not present in the second temple, but some were. Eventually, we lost sovereignty over the land, and we lost the second temple, and we began this long, long exile. And though as a people we have survived and maintained a relationship with God, at least some core of the Jewish people always have, even as many Jews tragically have wandered off the derech, wandered away from that relationship with God. Enough, have remained in that relationship, and God said he would never abandon the Jewish people. And so we are still here. But we see that there was an earlier time where even if a rabbinic court was not sort of, examining and trying death penalty cases and imposing the death penalty on people who were guilty of a death penalty offense and deserved it, that even if the court wasn't going to carry out those death penalties, somehow God would arrange for the people who were liable to the death penalty to receive it, right? So if they were liable to stoning for a certain offense, they ended up falling off a cliff, or they were trampled by wild beasts, which sort of produced the same effect. You probably have to say that over time the level of the people dropped, so that even that sort of level of justice being worked out within the lifetimes of everyone in the nation wasn't happening so much. We didn't merit to have this, right? And so some criminals would get away with it. Although, there's accountability for everybody, it doesn't always happen during the earthly lifetime. Since we all are souls, we have bodies, we are souls, everyone is going to be held accountable for everything that they've done in this life. They'll be rewarded for all the good and punished for all the bad. And our souls, have plenty of time in the world of souls to work that through. And that's what Gehenna is for. It's that place of purification when we leave this world. Now, some would say, by the way, that the spiritual level of the Jewish people as a whole has been rising in more modern times, as there is a thirst for Torah in the world and a thirst for the Messianic age and the coming of Mashiach, and all of us are kind of rising, and we're very close. We're on the brink, right? We're right on the brink of the coming of Mashiach, right near the end of history, as it were. And so it must be, maybe we didn't merit it, but somehow we're around, in this late date in history when Mashiach is around the corner. At any rate, it's a discussion for another day. Okay, Rava said, an additional explanation, the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakan is from here. It is written that one who gives his children to Molech, right? So in the Torah describes that there were people in Canaan before the Jews came in who practiced child sacrifice, and they would give their children to this idolatrous god Molech. The one who gives his children to Molech is liable to be executed by stoning. And if the people of the land do at all hide their eyes from that man when he gives his seed to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I, God, will set my face against that man and against his family, and will cut him off. That's Leviticus 20, verses 4 and 5, which shows that this person who's deserving of the death penalty, if the people around him let him get away with it, either because they didn't detect that he was doing that, or they were afraid to exact justice upon him, then God would take care of it, right? So at this earlier time in history, God would see to it that everyone deserving of the death penalty received it, even in their earthly lifetime. So through the juxtaposition in this verse of the Torah, the Torah said, my charis is like your death penalty. Charis is death at the hands of the heavenly court. And it is like your death penalty, the earthly court. Just as one who is liable to receive your death penalty is exempt from the associated payments, so too one who is liable to receive my charis is exempt from the associated payments. And the Gemara asks, what practical difference is there between the opinions of Rava and Abaye with regard to the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana? And the Gemara answers, there's a difference between them with regard to a non-priest who intentionally ate teruma. Teruma is consecrated food that only priests may eat. If a non-priest eats teruma intentionally, he's liable to the death penalty at the hands of the heavenly court. According to Abaye, he is exempt from paying the priest the value of the teruma that he ate, as a non-priest who ate teruma is liable to receive death at the hand of heaven. So Abaye maintains that the legal status of all forms of death at the hand of heaven is equivalent to that of death at the hands of man, and therefore one is exempt from payment. If you receive the death penalty from an earthly court, you don't pay the fine that you committed at the same time for the crime you committed at the same time. And likewise, according to Abaye, if you receive the death penalty for a transgression at the hands of the heavenly court, you don't have to pay the fine. And according to Rava, who derives the rationale from the juxtaposition between charis and death at the hands of man, since a non-priest who ate teruma is not liable to receive charis, he is liable to pay the priest for the teruma that he ate. And so the Gemara asks, and according to Abaye, is a non-priest actually exempt from the payment for the teruma? But didn't Rav Chisda say that Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana concedes with regard to one who steals another's forbidden fat and eats it, that he is obligated to pay for the fat, even though he is liable to receive charis, as he was already liable for theft before he came to violate the prohibition against eating forbidden fat. Forbidden fat is a food that a Jew cannot eat. It's part of the animal that's not kosher. Even from a kosher animal, the forbidden fat is not kosher. So if it belonged to another person, right, but he can't eat it, it's not kosher for any Jew. Yeah, but the other Jew might be using that fat as grease, for his tool shed, or he's going to sell it to non-Jews who are permitted to eat it. So he's entitled to the value of the forbidden fat. Now, this Jew steals the forbidden fat from that guy. Okay, when he eats it, so he's now committed a transgression that if he does intentionally can result in charis. But when he stole it from that other guy, okay, so now he committed theft and he owes that guy the value of what he stole, plus a penalty, in fact. So are we going to say that because he's guilty to death at the hands of the heavenly court for intentionally eating the forbidden fat, that he's excused from paying back the person that he stole it from? Answer, according to this view, no, he's not excused because he stole it and became liable to pay for it before he ate it, and therefore he has to pay for a crime that he committed at a different time than when he got the death penalty offense for eating the forbidden fat. They didn't happen simultaneously. So now what are they going to do? They're going to make, unusual circumstances so that the stealing and the eating happen at exactly the same time. Apparently, from the moment he lifts the fat to steal it, he acquired it, and he bears responsibility to repay it, but he is liable to receive the death penalty only when he eats it. So here, too, with regard to a non-priest who ate teruma, at the moment he lifts the teruma, he acquired it, and he's responsible to repay it to the priest, and he is liable to receive the death penalty only when he eats it. And so the Gemara answers, but with what are we dealing here? It is a case where another person inserted the teruma into his mouth. So in that case, he didn't steal it from the priest, and when it enters his mouth is the very moment when he acquires it, just as he's eating it. So since he took it from the priest at the same time that he ate food that is prohibited to him because he's a non-priest, do we say that his death penalty offense cancels his liability for monetary damages? So the Gemara asks, ultimately, once he chewed the teruma, he acquired it, and he's liable to pay. And he's liable to receive the death penalty only when he swallows it. So the fact that somebody else put it in his mouth doesn't matter. He becomes obligated to pay a few moments before he receives the death penalty for actually swallowing it. Since the two are not simultaneous, he should be liable to pay. So what does the Gemara do? Let's push the circumstances. Actually, it is a case where another inserted it into the pharynx. So the liability for payment and liability for the death penalty were both achieved through swallowing at the very same moment. So the Gemara says, what are the circumstances? If it is possible to retrieve the teruma by removing it without ruining it, let him retrieve it. If one does so, he would not be liable to pay. If he fails to do so, liability or payment precedes liability for the death penalty. If it is not possible to retrieve the teruma, why is he liable? He did nothing. Another person inserted the food in his throat. And the Gemara answers, it is necessary only in a situation where it is possible to retrieve the teruma under duress with great effort. So he had a choice, even though somebody else stuck it into his throat. So Rav Papa said, no. It is referring to a case where another inserted liquids of teruma into his mouth. As soon as the liquid enters his mouth, it is ruined. There's no possibility of returning it. Therefore, the acquisition and his enjoyment are simultaneous. And Rav Ashi said it is referring to a non-priest who partook of his own teruma. For example, if the non-priest inherited teruma from a priest or acquired ownership from a priest. In that case, he did not steal the teruma, and there is no payment for it, but he is liable to receive the death penalty for eating teruma. And at the same time, he tore another's silk. And the question is whether the liability to receive the death penalty exempts him from the liability for payment incurred at precisely the same moment. He happened to commit a crime that has a financial penalty at the very same moment that he committed a transgression that has a death penalty component. Even though the two things are unrelated, they happen at the same moment. Now we're on 31a. The Gemara analyzes the matter itself. Rav Chisda said, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana concedes, in the case of one who steals another's forbidden fat and he eats it, that he is obligated to pay for the fat, as he is already liable for the theft, before he comes to violate the prohibition against eating the forbidden fat. So the Gemara comments, okay, let us say that Rav Chisda disagrees with Rabbi Avin. As Rabbi Avin said, one who shoots an arrow from the beginning of 4 cubits to the end of 4 cubits in the public domain on Shabbos, thereby performing a prohibited labor for which he is liable to receive a court-imposed death penalty. If he did it on purpose, a court will give you the death penalty for violating Shabbos. It's never imposed, but we're talking about what is the actual law, right? So that's a court-imposed death penalty, earthly death penalty. And the arrow that he shot ripped silk as it proceeds. And so he is exempt from the obligation to pay for the silk because he is liable for the more severe punishment of desecrating Shabbos, right? So if you shoot an arrow in the public domain on Shabbos, it's going to go more than 4 cubits, right? You caused it to move more than 4 cubits in the public domain. You violated Shabbos. If you did that on purpose and you were warned not to do it because you'd be violating Shabbos and you did it anyway in front of witnesses, so they could try you in an earthly court and impose a death penalty. Like I said, they never did that, but they could. We're talking about what is the absolute law in this. So if you became liable to a death penalty in the hands of an earthly court, and at the very same action, that arrow that you shot pierced somebody's silk that's their property, so you owe them money for ruining their piece of silk. But at the same moment, the same action caused you to receive a death penalty, so then they don't make you pay for the silk because you don't have both a fine and death penalty, both a fine and lashes or a fine and death penalty. Then the fine is excused. So the prohibited labor of carrying on Shabbos is comprised of lifting of the object and placement. Once he shot the arrow, its movement through the air is a continuation of his act of Shabbos desecration for which he is liable to be executed. So here too, say that lifting the fat is a prerequisite for eating, and therefore he should be exempt from payment. So the Gemara refutes this argument. How can these cases be compared? There in the case of the arrow, placement is impossible without lifting, as placement without lifting is not a labor prohibited on Shabbos. Right? To actually be guilty of transgressing Shabbos by moving an object either from a private domain to a public domain, or from a public domain to a private domain, or more than 4 cubits in the public domain. The complete action, as we learned in Tractate Shabbos, is lift the object, move it to the new domain, or more than 4 cubits in the public domain, and place it, right? So if you didn't finish the act, you kind of like lifted something, kind of stuck it out there, but then you pulled it back into the private domain and put it down. So you never lifted in one domain, transported to another domain, and placed it down. You didn't do the 3 elements of it. So now they're saying that with the arrow, okay, well, you have to take up the arrow, then shoot it, and then it has to come to rest, okay? So in the case of the arrow, placement is impossible without lifting, as placement without lifting is not a labor prohibited on Shabbos. Therefore, lifting and placement are a single unit. In contrast, here, eating is possible without lifting, as if one wishes, he could bend down and eat without lifting the food to his mouth. It's weird, right? Like if the food was on the ground, the forbidden fat, and you just bent down and put it in your mouth without lifting it, I guess we're talking about Shabbos, so then you never lifted. You ate before you lifted, right? You kind of ate in place with your mouth on the ground. So alternatively, there's another difference between the cases. There, in the case of the arrow, even if he seeks to take back the arrow after shooting it, he cannot take it back. Therefore, lifting and placement constitute one action. But here, he could replace the fat after lifting it. Again, we're examining whether when he lifted this fat and then ate it, did he become liable for replacing the monetary value at the same moment that it became liable to a kares penalty for intentionally eating forbidden fat? The Gemara asks, what practical difference is there between this formulation, where the criterion is whether the second stage could be performed independent of the first stage, and that formulation where the criterion is whether the second stage is inevitable after performing the first stage? And the Gemara responds, there is a practical difference between them with regard to one who carries a knife in the public domain, and he tears silk as he proceeds. So according to that formulation where you said, lifting is a prerequisite for placement, here too, lifting is a prerequisite for placement. As these two stages are inexorably connected, they constitute one action, and the one carrying the knife is exempt from paying the damages, because I guess his lifting and placing happened at once. Like the lifting is when the action of carrying on Shabbos originated, and as soon as he lifts, that's when that action began, and it came before when he tore the silk. So he was already liable to the death penalty even before he became liable for destroying somebody else's property, which has the monetary penalty. Since he was liable to the death penalty offense first, he's going to be excused from the monetary penalty. Rav, so Rav Beva, wait, what did I say? Conversely, according to that formulation where you said he cannot take back the arrow, and that is why they are considered one action, here he can take back the knife. Therefore, lifting and placement are separate actions, and he is not exempt from punishment for the damages that he caused. Right? If lifting and placement are not all part of the same action, because you can take it back once you started, so then we don't begin the action of carrying at the moment of lifting, but rather as he's walking through the public domain and he tears the silk at the same time, and that's why it happened simultaneously, and he could be liable for both tearing the silk and violating Shabbos. Now the Gemara analyzes the matter itself. Rabbi Avin said, with regard to one who shoots an arrow from the beginning of 4 cubits to the end of 4 cubits, and the arrow rips silk as it proceeds, he is exempt, as lifting is a prerequisite for placement. It's all one action with respect to the arrow, so he became liable to the death penalty for violating Shabbos, and the silk came after, and so he's exempt from paying the fine. Rabbeve bar Abaye raised an objection from that which is taught in a Baraisa. One who steals a purse on Shabbos is liable for the theft, because he was already liable for theft as soon as he lifted the purse. Right? He became liable for theft when he lifted the purse. He didn't become liable for violating Shabbos until he moved the purse on Shabbos, lifted, moved, placed. Right? So the liability for theft preceded the liability for violating Shabbos. And this took place before he came to violate the prohibition against performing prohibited labor on Shabbos by carrying it into the public domain, a violation punishable by stoning. However, if he did not lift the purse, but he was dragging it on the ground and exiting the private domain, dragging and exiting. So he never lifted, moved, and placed. Rather, he dragged. It's a kind of loophole because he moved something on Shabbos without lifting, transporting, and placing. And so since he only dragged it, it's a very abnormal way to move an object, and he doesn't become liable for violating Shabbos because of it. He is exempt as the prohibition against theft and prohibition of Shabbos are violated simultaneously when he drags the purse out of the owner's property, right? The action didn't begin when he lifted the purse because he never lifted it. So since he was dragging it from the private domain out to the public domain, at the moment he crosses the threshold, yes, he's guilty of violating Shabbos, and that's the same moment when he stole it from the owner because he took it from the owner's property out to the public property. So since the two things happen at the same time, he's going to be exempt, right? Exempt from paying the fine. So Rav Bevai concludes, but why is he liable if he carried the purse? Here too, let us say that lifting is a prerequisite for carrying out. And so he's going to be not liable for the fine because the death penalty and the fine took place at the same time. So now Rav Bevai asks, but why is he liable for carrying the purse? Here too, let us say that lifting is a prerequisite for carrying out, and therefore as soon as he lifted the purse, he becomes liable. The Gemara answers with, what are we dealing here? So with a case where he lifted the pouch in order to conceal it in the same domain, not to carry it out to the public domain. And he reconsidered his plan with regard to the purse, and then he carried it out. So at the time that he lifted the purse, he wasn't intending to lift it and carry it out to the public domain. He was intending to steal it by just hiding it within the same domain where he already is. But then, once he had already lifted it, he decided to carry it out. But the lifting is not an integral part of the carrying in that situation. So the Gemara asks, and in a case like that, where he reconsidered, is one liable for carrying out an object on Shabbos? But didn't Rav Simon say that Rabbi Ami said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, one who moves objects from one corner of his house to another corner on Shabbos, and he reconsidered his plan in their regard after lifting them and carried them out into the public domain, he is exempt just from violating Shabbos, as the act of lifting was not initially performed for that purpose of carrying from one domain to another. Here too, since the thief did not lift the pouch with the intention of carrying it outside, he is not liable to be stoned. And the Gemara amends the previous answer. Do not say that he lifted in order to conceal it. Rather say he lifted it in order to carry it out. Nevertheless, the case of shooting the arrow and the case of stealing the purse are different. As with what case are we dealing here? It is a case where he stopped in the courtyard before taking the pouch out to the public domain. Therefore, the initial lifting is exclusively theft and not the start of a prohibited labor, as by stopping, he separated the lifting from the carrying out. And the Gemara asks, this is a case where he stopped. For what purpose did he stop? If he stopped in order to adjust the burden on his shoulder, so that is the typical manner of proceeding, and would not be considered an interruption in the process of carrying out the object. Rather, it must be in a case of one who stopped to rest. And when he resumes moving, he initiates a separate action. So the Gemara infers, but if he stopped in order to adjust the burden on his shoulder, what is the law? He would be exempt. If that is the case, rather than teaching, if he was dragging and exiting, he is exempt. Let the Tana distinguish and teach the distinction within the case of carrying itself like this. In what case are these matters stated? It is in a case where he stopped to rest. However, if he stopped to adjust the burden on his shoulder, he is exempt. Again, taking a step back, what are we talking about here? We're asking if a death penalty offense, whether at the hands of an earthly court or at the hands of the heavenly court, the crime which leads to that death penalty offense happens, also causes monetary damage, and ultimately go back to our Mishna, right? We're talking about if a man rapes a woman who is prohibited to him because, for example, she's a mamzeret or she's a menstruating woman. So he would get a death penalty offense for sleeping with her intentionally or for committing rape. But yet there's also a penalty, right? We know in the Torah that the rapist gets two simultaneous penalties. He has to marry her if she's willing and pay the fine. So if this woman is also prohibited to him because of some other prohibition like incest, like she's his sister, so then he can't marry her, but he still has to pay the fine. So then they're asking, but wait a minute, but if you get a death penalty and a fine at the same time, you're exempt from paying the fine. And so now we're analyzing all these cases and they're saying, is that really true? Aren't there examples where if you get a death penalty, if you commit an offense that results in both the death penalty and liability to pay damages, do we always exempt the person from paying the damages? And they're saying, well, here's all these cases where we don't. They pay the damages too. But the distinction they're drawing is, but the reason you pay the damages is not because they happen at the same time. It's because you became liable to pay the damages in a moment earlier than you became liable for the death penalty. So now they're trying to orchestrate the circumstances so that the crime for which you get a death penalty happened at exactly the same moment as you became liable to pay damages. And then aren't you exempt from paying the damages? They're trying to find cases where you're not exempt from paying the damages to prove what we're looking for in the case of the rapist. So, rather, the Gemara explains why one is liable in the case where he carries the purse. In accordance with whose opinion was this law taught? It is in accordance with the opinion of Ben Azai, who said, the legal status of one who walks is like that of one who stops, as each step constitutes a pause between the actions of lifting and placement. Right, so we're examining when do you become liable for violating Shabbos by carrying an object either from one domain to another, private to public or public to private, or more than 4 cubits in the public domain. Now we're actually doing a little bit of a deep dive on Shabbos law that we learned in Tractate Shabbos. So they're asking, if you're stealing an object at the same time that you're carrying it on Shabbos, did you commit the death penalty offense at exactly the moment that you stole? Now, the initial lifting is not part of the prohibited labor of carrying out. So the Gemara infers, but if one throws the object into another domain, what is the law? He would be exempt from payment, as the lifting is the start of the prohibited labor of carrying out. So if so, let the Tana distinguish and teach the distinction within the case itself without resorting to the case of dragging and exiting as follows. In what case are these matters stated? It is the case of one who walks, so that there is separation between lifting and carrying out, right? When do you become liable for violating Shabbos? Because you lifted an object, you carried it out, and you put it down. So if you did that complete action, did you only actually become liable for committing that crime at the moment you finished the actions? Or was it all one continuous action and you became liable for the death penalty as soon as you started it? You might have canceled it in the middle, but you didn't. So didn't you become liable as soon as you started that action because it's one continuous action? And they're saying, no, it's not one continuous action, according to some opinions. So the Gemara answers, according to the opinion of Ben Azai, that would in fact be a more appropriate distinction. However, for the case of one who was dragging and exiting, so he never lifted, it was necessary for the Tana to teach because it includes a novel element, as it might enter your mind to say that this is not a typical manner of carrying out, and one is not liable to the death penalty for performing a prohibited labor if he does so in an atypical manner. Therefore, it teaches us that this too is a manner of carrying out. And the Gemara asks, and we're almost done. We're on page 31b. And in what case is this so? If it is in the case of large purses, obviously dragging is the typical manner. And there's nothing novel in this. And if it is in the case of small purses, there's nothing, dragging is certainly not its typical manner. And one would certainly not be liable. Rather, it must be referring to medium-sized purses. Although they are not always carried out in this manner, since they are sometimes dragged, the novelty is that he is liable for desecrating Shabbos and exempt from the payment for theft. So the Gemara continues, and in this case, to where did he carry out the pouch? If he carried it out of the owner's private domain to the public domain, there is violation of the prohibition of Shabbos. However, there's no violation of the prohibition against theft, as one does not acquire an item by pulling it into the public domain. If he carried it out from the owner's private domain to his own private domain, then there is violation of the prohibition against theft. However, there's no violation of the prohibition of Shabbos when you go private domain to private domain. So the Gemara answers, this ruling is necessary only in a case where he carried it out to the sides of the public domain. This is referring to the area in the public domain adjacent to the houses located on its sides, demarcated from the thoroughfare by small pegs, and not by a full-fledged partition. And the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is this taught? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said the legal status of the sides of the public domain is like that of the public domain. So there is violation of the prohibition of Shabbos. However, there's no violation of the prohibition against theft. So if it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis who said the legal status of the sides of the public domain is not like that of the public domain, so then there is violation of the prohibition against theft. However, there's no violation of the prohibition of Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, actually, it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And when Rabbi Eliezer said the legal status of the sides of the public domain is like the public domain, that applies only with regard to the liability for performing prohibited labor on Shabbos, as occasionally the multitudes crowd and enter there. However, with regard to the matter of acquiring an object and thus committing theft, one acquires it by dragging it there. And what is the reason for this law? It is due to the fact that the public is not typically found in that location, and acquisition can be effected in a place where the multitudes are not typically found. And the hour is late and it's Friday, so we'll just stop there. And as I mentioned at the top, no class tomorrow night, Saturday night, because we'll be in the fast of Tisha B'Av, and no class on Sunday, because we'll still be in the fast of Tisha B'Av. And so we'll resume on Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. We did a double daf today, and we'll do a double daf on Monday, and so we'll be on the Daf Yomi schedule with God's help after completing the 2 pages on Monday. No class Saturday, no class Sunday. All right, let's see if there's any questions I can answer on Kesubos pages 30 and 31. Lysiuk and Eugenia. What if the rapist is a mamzer and the female is not a mamzer? As a woman, I find this highly interesting. So if the rapist is a mamzer, he's prohibited from marrying her. So he can't marry her because she's prohibited to marry him, as it were, right? You could say, well, maybe she doesn't object, right? Even though it's beneath her to marry a mamzer. But no, they don't have the choice. A Jew is not permitted to marry a mamzer. So he's going to be liable to pay the fine, the rapist's fine, just according to that area of the law. He's also liable, for injuring her, for humiliating her, for everything else. But he's not going to be permitted to marry her and fulfill that part of the punishment where he would marry her and never have the ability to divorce her. He'd have to support her for the rest of his life. That part is off the table because he's a mamzer. Rebecca. Does the woman have a say in the case of betrothed couple? Are you saying, does she have the right to break off the betrothal, right? Because it's a unilateral right in the patriarchal system that men can divorce women. So if they're only at the betrothal stage, can she break off the betrothal? That's a great question. I'm not sure. So first of all, as we're learning here in this chapter, there would be 3 stages of her life where there's different answers. Right, so while she's a minor, her father has the right to betroth her, and her father would have the right to break it off. When she's a legal adult, it's only on her, right? So she has the right to accept or reject betrothal. Does she have the right to walk away from the betrothal before getting married? The thing is, only he can give the get, but I want to say she can break it off, but she's not going to be permitted, like no one's going to force her to enter the chuppah, to go into the marriage canopy. But she won't be free to marry someone else until this guy gives her a bill of divorce. And then when she's in that in-between stage called a young woman, right, where she's hit puberty and for the next 6 months before she's a full adult, the answer might be different. But my sense is, I'm not sure, you definitely have to look this up, but my sense is she can break off the betrothal. She's not forced to marry him, but she's going to need a get before she's permitted to someone else. Sharon, I realize that this is a stretch, but if a non-priest is starving and poor, and he eats teruma belonging to a priest, is that poor Jew still subject to punishment? So I think the question you're asking is if he's saving his life by eating the teruma, what is he liable for? I mean, we desecrate Shabbos to save a life. And that's like really that's one of the 10 commandments, right? Eating teruma is not at the level of the 10 commandments. So my guess is that to save a life, we feed teruma to a non-priest. Does he become liable to pay the priest back for the teruma that he ate, plus probably 20% penalty? Although it might not be theft, right? Since we just gave it to him. So so it's not theft, but it's hekdesh, right? So it's appropriating for your own use something that is consecrated, right? Holy property. When you use it, even though it's not technically theft, it's treated like theft. So I think you'd be liable to pay for the teruma plus a penalty, but he's not liable to kares because, they gave him the teruma so that he wouldn't die. It was a pikuach nefesh situation. I'm not sure, I'm not a rabbi, but I'm pretty sure that's how it would come out, That would require more research, but that's my sense. Bill, what if you shot the arrow and you thought it wouldn't travel 4 cubits? That is, you were warned you would be liable for moving it more than 4 cubits on Shabbos, but you say, no, the bow is warped, it'll fall 3 cubits only, and you were wrong. Great question, right? You committed the action that resulted in the arrow going more than 4 cubits, but your kavanah, your intention, was not to violate Shabbos and to do an action that would not violate Shabbos if it came out the way that you intended. So first of all, you didn't intentionally violate Shabbos, right? There was a discussion like this in Tractate Shabbos. So can you say it was unwitting? This might be the difference between unwitting and unintentional. But can you say it's unintentional when you expected a different outcome, but it was you who performed the action? Part of the analysis might be, was it reasonable for you to think that you could shoot an arrow and it would only go 3 cubits? Maybe that was a ridiculous intention, but it was your intention, So these would all be questions that go into the analysis. I'm not sure where the answer would come out. And Tom, so the person owning the silk is out of luck. Right, now that's what we really have to wonder about. Thank you for bringing up that question. Right? If you're saying that a person who becomes liable to a death penalty, either at the hands of an earthly court, like for violating Shabbos intentionally after warning, or at the hands of the heavenly court, like sleeping with certain people who are prohibited to you, but not committing adultery, for example, and at the same moment, your action, like damage property, like rip the silk that belongs to somebody else, from that person's point of view, the owner of the silk, they're like, hey, you violating Shabbos, that's between you and God. What about my silk? And maybe it was like a very expensive silk. Maybe it was a very rare piece of art that got damaged, worth millions of dollars. And, your action in violating Shabbos, it's between you and God, and maybe you did other good things in your life and God isn't going to shorten your life by very much. But the guy who owned the painting, he's completely out of luck, according to this analysis. And so that's why, that's why we don't make assumptions and why we don't poskin from the Gemara, because that's a very difficult, delicate question. And the sage that you bring the case to will start analyzing, whoa. When exactly did you become liable for ruining the painting? And when did you become liable for violating Shabbos? And if those things didn't happen exactly the same moment, then maybe you're liable to replace the painting for its owner, right? We haven't really ended this discussion. We haven't come to the final conclusion, but you put your finger right on what's at stake. All right, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together on Monday, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. May you have a sweet Shabbos and an easy fast beginning Saturday night and all through Sunday as we observe Tisha B'Av and remember what we lost when we lost the temple.